Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. We have almost 600 foundation leaders registered for this call, so I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of interest in what's next for the philanthropic sector. And boy, oh boy, what a week we've all had. I know everyone is still reeling, trying to understand all the moving pieces. So this call that we're doing today supplements and supports a few other conversations that we've been having before and then after last week's unprecedented election. For example, last Wednesday we had an impromptu call with many of you, and I had the opportunity to talk about this important national moment. Tonight we're co-hosting an in-person event at the Independent Sector Conference on the election, and then Thursday evening a small group of senior communicators are getting together to talk about messaging around how this election might impact the narrative that our sector builds around its work. Each of these activities, we hope, helps us learn from you about your current concerns and thinking, and in turn allows us to share our thoughts with you. You know, this time between election and inauguration goes very, very quickly, so we want to do our best to communicate important developments, and the way we're going to be doing that primarily is through our weekly policy newsletter, Washington Snapshot. If you don't already read it every week, which I hope you do, please be on the lookout because this is an important time to be tracking activities. I also hope you'll send your thoughts on the significance of the election and flag for us any developments you're thinking about. I've already gotten a few calls just in the last couple of days to schedule conversations. We really look to you to help us know what to pay a particular attention to. And many of you are following particular issues like education and conservation. So in this active period, please overshare with us, and we promise to do the same. So before I get to the meat of this call, I have some news to share. First of all, Chris Gates, whom many of you likely know and have worked with, has joined the council team as Executive Vice President for External Affairs. This is a newly created position that combines public policy, communications, and member relations. I think this is particularly important now as the Council works even harder to amplify and advocate for your great work. For those of you who might not know Chris, he's been working with us as a senior fellow for a little bit about a year now to help us with our campaign to protect foundation endowments and all that they make possible. Prior to that, Chris served as the CEO of the Sunlight Foundation and was the executive director of PACE, the philanthropy, it's an affinity group, Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement. His experience is deep in democratic renewal and civic engagement, and that couldn't be more timely, so I'm thrilled to have him join our team overseeing policy. And secondly, unrelated to Chris's appointment, I'd also like to share some sad news that Sue Santa will be leaving the council. Sue has resigned her role effective at the end of this month and is excited to pursue other opportunities at this stage in her career. Sue has been such a powerful force for the council. She's been an important partner for me in our leadership as we've continued to strengthen our policy work. And I wish her nothing but the best for the future, and I know you join me in wishing her well. And Hadar Suskind has been promoted to Senior Vice President of Government Relations, a function we continue to strengthen with additional staff. And Hadar is now part of Chris's newly formed expanded team. So now let's get to the meat of our program. Simply put, we're prepared for this election result. We've met with Trump campaign staff, and along with colleagues, we've submitted suggestions to the transition team. Over the last few years, we've steadily built strong relationships with congressional leaders and their policy staffs. We've really beefed up our government relations capacity, and we've built a program that allows us to mobilize our membership when it's necessary to make change happen, or when it's necessary to make sure change doesn't happen. Last year, we used this capacity to help pass the America Gives More Act, and we intend to use it again in the forthcoming discussions about tax reform. One thing's for sure, though, pretty much every single article I've seen since the election includes tax reform as a Trump administration priority. That said, though, there are still lots of unknowns, and we're just beginning to understand what will come next. We're fortunate to have two speakers on our call today who are going to shed some light on that. We face a climate of fierce anti-establishment sentiment, and many of our core values as both a field, I think, and a country have been called into question during this election. Our country's tired, our country's divided, our country's angry. One side is expressing delight and pride because they feel their voice is finally being heard. The other side feels deeply shaken by the apparent ascendance of misogynistic, racist, and xenophobic sentiments. In many ways, President-elect Trump is leading us into uncharted territory, and that leaves us with some key questions. How can philanthropy best use this moment to lift up those who are making a positive difference? How can we help those who are less sure about their own place in our nation? President-elect Trump, he ran on a platform of radical change, and now, with Republican control of the House of Representatives and the Senate, a unified federal government can make that change possible. The President-elect's early policy priorities, though, as I've said, are still unclear, and although we've received preliminary signals about who will fill key transition and administration posts, we're not yet ready to make detailed recommendations for the field. Many of us have strong feelings about what has happened. I want to echo here the sentiments of Secretary Clinton and President Obama. They reminded us that our work does go on, and they asked the country to keep an open mind. They've called for us to give this new government a chance to lead. It's important to note that the alignment of a Republican White House and Congress does make comprehensive tax reform even more likely. I think that's the punchline. The makeup of Congress is not very different than it was, and we've been laying the groundwork for over a year around tax reform. We're at the table with both House Ways and Means and Senate Finance staff representing our sector in the discussions happening around tax policy. Tax reform is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to strengthen things like getting the IRA rollover expanded to DAPs and simplifying the private foundation excise tax. But that being said, we also need to go into this with eyes wide open and thinking comprehensively, knowing that everything is on the table, from threats to endowments to the very existence of the charitable tax deduction. The Council also understands that policy is driven by what's happening outside of D.C. As a field, I think we've got to better understand those who voted for this massive change. The credibility of foundations rests with our ability to listen and to spend time engaging meaningfully with the parts of the community that cried out this week for a change in the status quo. By taking time to listen, by taking time to build bridges, to find a way towards better understanding our neighbors, it's philanthropy that can strengthen public trust in our field. We've got to continue to connect our work to those who need inspiration. Our core values of equality, of opportunity and dignity remain as important, perhaps even more important than ever before. Our field, with its capacity to fuel transformational social change, has a moral responsibility to focus each and every day on the impact we're trying to make. And that impact has to be foremost in our minds. I think our country and the broader world deserve nothing less. We're uniquely suited as philanthropy to building the bridges we need. Your institutions aren't tethered to one party or a city or a cause. We also know that from research conducted by independent sector that more than 3/4 of Americans trust and value the charitable sector. And that's why we believe that philanthropy has such an important role to play in helping our country heal and come together, as well as to stand up for all the causes we hold dear. The country will surely be looking to philanthropy and the broader social sector for a positive vision for leadership, and we have to be ready to lead together. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it back to Hadar.
Thank you, Vicki, for your remarks and for bringing us all together today. With that, I am honored to introduce our first guest speaker, Connie Schultz. Connie is a columnist who won the 2005 Pulitzer Prize for commentary for doing what the judges called her pungent columns that provide a voice for the underdog and the underprivileged. Those of you who have read her work know that it is a common theme for her. In addition to the Pulitzer, Connie's won the Scripps Howard National Journalism Award for commentary and the National Headliner Award for commentary. She was also elected to the Cleveland Journalism Hall of Fame. Connie was a 2003 Pulitzer Prize finalist for her series The Burden of Innocence, which chronicled the ordeal of Michael Green, who was imprisoned for 13 years for a rape he did not commit. The week after her series ran, the real rapist turned himself in after reading her stories. That, ladies and gentlemen, is journalism. With that, I turn the floor over to Connie Schultz.
Thank you, Hadar, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, if you weren't familiar with my work, you've now heard a little bit about it, so it will not surprise you, I suspect, that I'm going to start with talking about who is feeling despondent and scared right now. In 2004, here in Ohio, we had the worst of 11 ballot initiatives to further restrict the rights of the LGBT community, and it passed overwhelmingly here. That was the same year, of course, that George Bush won re-election. And one of my Pulitzer columns is about what happened that following Sunday in our church. We were in a United Church of Christ service, and after watching various people stand up to do various roles, to perform various roles in the service, the head pastor then got up and she addressed directly what had happened, because we had a significant LGBT population in our congregation, and the same people who had just stood up, the steward for giving money to the children to the poor, the choir director who had led us in a Gregorian chant, she asked all those who were directly affected by the passage of what was called Issue 1 to stand. And at first it was all these people who had just spoken in front of us in all the different marvelous ways they served the congregation. And about 50 others stood up around us, and we started to look around, and then it suddenly dawned on us, and many of us started to cry, that we all had to stand, because it affected all of us if we cared anything about the people who are already on their feet. And if there's any theme I'm trying to strike right now, as I field a steady flood of calls and emails, social media messages, conversations with my students. I'm a professional in residence at the journalism school at Kent State, and conversations with total strangers who come up to me in public. It's that we have to address how we are all in this still, that we are here for the very people who are now afraid that they are going to lose the voices of the people who have championed them. I was talking to a fellow journalist yesterday who told me that he thought he'd take a break from all of this, and he took a 7-year-old son to a game 2 hours away from where he lives in Hudson, Ohio, closer to the Pennsylvania border, thinking they'd go watch a high school game where he used to coach some of the kids. And they're sitting in the stands, and when the head coach, who was black, started to reprimand a player, the entire team was white, and he made the young man sit down on the bench. A father stood up and yelled, look how he thinks he can talk to our kids. And then another person stood and said, yeah, he's got no right to talk to her. And my friend, the journalist, is sitting in shock, because he had coached the son of that first man who stood up. And he finally went over to him and he said, what are you doing? And he said, you know what, we don't have to be quiet anymore. We can say what we're all thinking. Well, it's not what we're all thinking, of course, and that is anecdotal, I understand, except that the anecdotes are piling up, as most of you know. And the question I keep hearing from people who reach out to me is, what do we do now? And I think it's a false narrative, certainly, to have one single narrative to explain what happened. Certainly a lot of my students know that, because they are white working class kids who, like me, are the first in their generation, and first in their family, to go to college. They certainly didn't support what has happened, and yet they also feel they're being blamed. It is so hard to watch. I come from the white working class, as I said, and I never want to romanticize them. I'm very proud of my roots. But we've always known that we have this other part among us that fears the other. And that certainly responded to this presidential campaign. But we also know that a lot of affluent people voted for Donald Trump. So I don't think there's any point in trying to just single out a single group. The thing that we need to make very clear now for ourselves as well as the people that we represent, and I say that as a columnist, and I'm certainly speaking to all of you who champion entire segments of the population who I write about often and who would not have the strong voice they have were it not for your efforts. Look how many of you are on this call right now says something to me about how committed you are. And so we have to ask ourselves, who are we fighting for? I think it's so important to not phrase it even in our own heads as what we're fighting against. It's who are we fighting for? They need to know that we stand with them. And they need to know that we will not abandon them. But I also see a real opportunity here. I understand I don't think we have the numbers yet. It's too soon for that. But I keep hearing we have a lot of foundations here in Cleveland, as you know, including the Cleveland Foundation. And I've been hearing from some of my friends who work for the various charitable organizations that there's been an uptick in new donors. And I think this is such an opportunity to reach out, to recruit and mobilize new donors and activists, because I really do believe still that most people in this country are good. I have learned this as a columnist after being a journalist for more than 35 years. Most people are good, but they don't know what to do. They want to make a difference, but they don't know how. And I think this is such a perfect moment, as sad and tragic and scary as it is for so many fellow Americans. I think it's a wonderful moment in time for all of you who are doing the good work, who are really trying to help the people who are most afraid or who need us most, to reach out to people who are looking for a reason to make a difference. And I don't want you, please do not doubt the leadership you can show now, because as many of you may know, I'm married to U.S. Senator Sherrod Brown. And when we first got married, he was in the House, and we actually started dating during the whole build-up to the Iraq War, which both of us opposed. We used to joke that one of our habits on Friday nights was to compare ugly hate mail, and that was quite a habit for a while there. Of course, the country has certainly changed in its view, but at the time, the public sentiment felt against us. And I remember saying to Sherrod at one point, I would never say my husband gets discouraged, but he certainly was feeling a bit low as we were taking a read of the land and watching what some editorial pages were saying at the time. And I said to him, and I still believe this, it's one thing to lead when you're in the majority. It's one thing to lead when you feel like most everyone's on your side anyway, but real leadership happens when you feel like the odds are against you and so many people are counting on you to make it clear that you won't give up. One of our close friends is Representative John Lewis, whom I'm sure all of you, probably many of you know him personally. You certainly know who he is, civil rights icon, frankly, a hero. We were with him at the 50th anniversary of Selma. And in 2008, I called John Lewis, who almost lost his life on that bridge in Selma, as you'll recall, beaten to a pulp by Alabama state troopers. And after the primary here in Ohio, when Hillary Clinton won, I knew it was not because a bunch of white working class guys were suddenly feminists. I knew that race was certainly a factor. And I was writing about the need for people like me to go back and talk to our families about the issue of race. And I called John to talk to him. And I said, John, how do I reach their hearts? How do I get there? And he said something to me that has informed my work ever since. He said, Connie, I don't need their hearts. I just need them to do the right thing. And I think that's where we start with this new administration. I'm not as optimistic right now as the rhetoric, the language that President Obama and Hillary Clinton necessarily must use. I understand that. I'm having a very hard time conceiving this notion of uniting behind what we're seeing so far, including an administrative fix so far. But I understand that we are a nonpartisan organization here as we speak. And so the idea that I would like to convey to all of you, and then I'll take questions, of course, if there are any, is this is a time to lead like no other. This is when so many people are looking to you, including in your own organization. Are you scared? Are you feeling hopeless? And the sooner, and I imagine most of you have already figured this out, if not all, but the sooner we can, Sherrod and I've talked about this a lot, as you can imagine, in the last 6 days. Some of us don't have the luxury of working through all of our emotions before we try to figure out what comes next. And I would say that includes everyone on this call. So I am open to your questions and thoughts, certainly, but that's where I land today on the day before the week anniversary of this election. Oh, wait a minute. What is today? Today is the 1 week anniversary. Man, losing track of time.
Connie, if that's all you're losing track of, you're doing better than most of us. Thank you very much. Great. So thank you very, very much, Connie. What I'd like to do as we're trying to just stay within our hour limit here is actually go straight into Ken, and then we'll have some time for questions for Connie and Ken or Vikki or all of us at the end. So again, thank you, Connie. With that, I want to introduce our next speaker. I'm very pleased to have Ken Keyes with us. Ken is the Managing Director of Federal Policy Group. Federal Policy provides sophisticated strategic and technical tax advice on policy matters before Congress, the U.S. Treasury Department, the IRS, the OECD, and most importantly, of course, the Council on Foundations. Ken really honed his expertise serving as the Chief of Staff for the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. He is one of the handful of people in Washington, around the country, and the world who are most deeply immersed in this, and we are very pleased to have his counsel always and to have him with us today. So with that, please take it away, Ken.
Okay, thanks, Hadar. And Connie, I just want to let you know that I actually lived in downtown Cleveland from 1977 to 81 when almost nobody lived there. When I was with Baker and Hostetler, and I felt like a real pioneer. And I was a big runner. I actually ran marathons, and I ran at night. And people would say, "Aren't you worried about crime?" And I said, "There's no problem. There's nobody here." So Cleveland has now made a great renaissance, so it's a good thing. So what I'm going to cover today is to try and give you a perspective on where we go from here. The title of my presentation is "The Election is Over, Thank God, Now What?" And the now what part could be quite consequential to the philanthropic sector, in particular in the area of tax reform. But I want to start, I'm going to really cover 4 topics. The first, and just because Vikki loves for me to always start on a high note, I'm going to remind everybody that the election didn't change our fiscal crisis that we're in, and it will potentially impact the decisions that this president-elect can make, this Congress can make, because the reality is we are in a terrible fiscal situation, and it didn't end last Tuesday night. I'm going to give you a little post-election commentary just in terms of looking at the outcome, and then some key takeaways from the Trump win, and then focus on what the tax legislative agenda is likely to look at like in 2017. So when we go to the next chart, just there's only one here, Vikki, so I'm not gonna make this miserable for everyone. But this one chart actually says it all. We are headed back to deficits as high as what we experienced in 2009 when we hit 1.4 trillion. This path we're on is unsustainable. The longer that we wait to address it, the more painful the decisions are going to be. And those decisions will require us to look at a number of things, including tax increases, entitlement reforms for the big entitlements that we have: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and of course Obamacare. And so the bottom line here is the new president coming in is facing what is a daunting picture. I have to say I'm rather disappointed myself that none of the candidates, none of the primary candidates, and none of the general election candidates barely talked about this situation, and yet it is among the most dire facing the future of the United States, and it's as though it doesn't exist. So enough about that. A quick look at post-election commentary, and I'm going to make this rather brief because these results are pretty much all known, although there are some updates. In terms of the House and Senate, Republicans look like they lost 7 seats. That was far below what was even the kind of the midpoint of what was projected. 10 to 15 was kind of the minimum, and a lot of people thought it could go higher. In the Senate races, it was going down to the wire. It was 50-50 as to whether Republicans or Democrats were going to control the Senate. As it turned out, Republicans will be at 52, assuming that they win the Louisiana runoff, which looks rather likely given the way in which the votes came in last Tuesday in Louisiana. So Republicans will be at 52, and Democrats and the independents that caucus with them will be at 48. The next chart shows what happened in the governor's races, and Republicans have a rather dominating position in the governor's races, which is significant in a lot of respects, not the least of which is the redistricting of the House legislative districts that will occur in 2020. The one thing that we don't know in this picture here is where North Carolina is going to come out. Right now, the Republican is behind, but it's fairly close. I would guess we're going to hear about that fairly soon. The next chart shows the outcome of the Electoral College vote, and actually there are some updates that came in just today. New Hampshire was put into the Clinton column, so her 228 goes to 232. On the other hand, Michigan narrowly looks like it was called for Trump, which is 16 more votes, so his number goes to 306. You would have to say that this dramatically surprises almost all the pollsters as much as a day before the election. The next chart really is just a look at the House situation, so we don't need to stay with that long. And the next chart is just a look at the Senate, and again, what it shows is Louisiana is still up in the air, and again, that runoff is in early December, and most people believe it's very likely to go to the Republican. So when we look at the next chart, we kind of take a look here at what has happened under President Obama to the Democratic Party. And part of the reason today the House Democrats decided to put off their leadership elections is they're in a very sort of situation of looking inward and trying to decide what went wrong and how do they change the future for their party. They were going to vote on continuing Nancy Pelosi as the minority leader of the House. They decided to put it off till after Thanksgiving. Republicans, on the other hand, not surprisingly, who are in a much better mood, had all their races, and notwithstanding stories of just a couple of days or a week or so ago that Paul Ryan was going to have a challenge to his speakership, none of that materialized. The Tea Party guys kind of just disappeared in light of the outcome of the election. So what we see here, just to quickly review, and then I'm going to underscore one aspect of this, but what we quickly see is when President Obama came into office, Democrats had 60 Senate seats. They're going to have 46 after the 2016 election, 257 House seats. They'll have 193. In the governor's offices, they had 28. They're now at 15, could go as high as 16, depending on how North Carolina comes out. The state legislative chambers, they had 62. They're down to 30. States where they control both legislative chambers, they were at 27, they're down to 13, and as you can see on those bottom two lines, at the state legislative level, in terms of individual seats, a dramatic change of position. Essentially, Democrats dropped close to 1,000, while Republicans picked up close to 1,000. These outcomes are significant from the Democrat, or from the governor's races on down, because they will have a large impact on that redistricting decision that gets made in 2020. In many states, the decision about redistricting is made by either the legislature or the governor or in combination. Some exceptions, California being one of them. And the key problem that the Democratic Party faces is that their bench has been significantly impacted by the last 7 years, the bench being the state legislative level where new politicians get groomed and experienced to move up to Congress, the House, the Senate, and so on. So for the Democratic Party, this is a pretty devastating time to take a look inward and say, what do we do to change this? And that's a process that they're going through right now. Enough of that. Let's go on to the key takeaways from the Trump win. And I see about 7 of them. The one that's most obvious is the pundits and pollsters were all wrong, almost all wrong, with the exception of the LA Times and Rasmussen poll that called the race for weeks as dead even. Virtually everybody else was wrong. K Street, which is our mean reference to lobbyists here in Washington, just for the record, I'm not on K Street, but K Street made a really bad bet. Of the registered lobbyists, 1.3 million went to Hillary Clinton, 74,000 went to Trump. The third takeaway is the impact on the president's executive orders and regulations. Part of the transition team The effort right now is to identify which executive orders they want to withdraw on Inauguration Day. This is not a process that's unique to Republican or Democrat presidents. Every new administration, when they come in, particularly if they're of a different party from the one leaving office, go through this process. What makes it a little different with respect to President Obama is the extensive extent to which he did use executive orders. So there's a little bit more of a focus on that. The withdrawal of executive orders will happen on Inauguration Day. The withdrawal of regulations takes longer because it has to follow the Administrative Procedure Act, but that's just a process of giving notice and consent and hearings and so on, but that will go on as well. Significant impact on Obamacare. A major challenge for the president-elect and Republicans is, how do you do this? Because you just can't turn off the healthcare system. And there are so many issues that one has to think about, yet we're going to clearly see legislation in this area. It's a question of how is it going to be designed, how are the effective dates going to be delayed to try and minimize the disruption to the millions of people that have health insurance, and the answers to these questions are far from easy. In terms of impact on the federal judiciary, not just the Supreme Court, there are 52 pending federal judicial nominations that the president has made that are unlikely to see approval. So significant consequence there. And obviously there's a lot of people watching the Supreme Court and wondering what happens in the 4 years that Trump is president. The one thing I can guarantee people is Ruth Bader Ginsburg will be there to the bitter end. The last thing she will do is retire. But you never know what else is going to occur, and the Supreme Court is obviously a very, very powerful institution of government. Impact on Obama's international agreements. There are a number that Trump has threatened to revisit. NAFTA is one of them, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Iranian deal. It's easy to make those statements when you're in a presidential campaign. It's a lot more complicated to figure out what are you actually going to do, but that's clearly a process that his White House is going to go through as they move through the transition and into taking power. And then finally, the impact on the Democratic and Republican parties. And I already mentioned sort of a key indicator here. The fact that House Democrats put off their elections shows that they really want to rethink where they're headed here, and maybe they need new leadership. Republicans clearly happy with the outcome. We're very pleased to go ahead and re-elect all of their leadership and move on. Now let me turn to the tax legislative agenda, because this is where there are decisions that are going to be made that will impact our sector, and in good and potentially bad ways. That's the reason the Council has significantly enhanced its legislative reach over the past couple of years, realizing that tax reform was a matter of only when, not if, and that there are major decisions that will be made in the process of tax reform that could impact the sector. So let's just look at what is the likely timetable. My own view is that there's an 80% probability that a major tax reform bill, comprehensive, both business and individual, will be enacted by the August recess of next year. That is based on a number of things, not the least of which is looking at history. History tells us that first-term presidents have a window of opportunity to do big things, but it doesn't stay open forever. And typically, it's the August recess of their first year in office that is a key deadline. And just by looking at history, in '81, Economic Recovery Tax Act of Reagan was done by the August recess. In '93, Clinton's budget deal was done by the August recess. In 2001, George W. Bush's $1.3 trillion tax cut was done by May, notwithstanding the debacle that he went through in Florida. And in 2009, the Obama stimulus bill and SCHIP, Children's Health Insurance Bill, was done by the August recess. So history tells us that that is a very real time frame in which to look for big things. Just as an added element of that, Paul Ryan, when he was the nominee for vice president under Romney, after the debates but before the election, he and Romney sat down and put together a timetable that they were planning to execute in 2013, under which tax reform, entitlement reform, and fiscal reform would be done by the August recess. In Paul Ryan's mind, that timetable has just been moved from 2013, which they didn't get to execute, to 2017. That this major period of legislation is also likely to include a repeal and replacement of Obamacare. It's likely to be done under reconciliation protection. The key to that is that it requires only 51 votes in the Senate to get it out. So Ryan has made that clear publicly. The timing of when this starts was last Wednesday, and they clearly are focused on a major agenda in 2017. In terms of major issues, there's a high probability that the estate tax could be repealed. It probably will include a carryover basis regime. It probably will include a provision that if appreciated property is transferred into a private foundation, that will be a deemed realization event, which would require a payment of tax on the unrealized gain. There is clearly a exposure we have that endowments will get looked at in this process. Unfortunately, there is interest from all sides of the political spectrum, from the right and the left, for different reasons, to look at the way in which foundations use their assets. And so this is a kind of a multi-dimensional area of risk for us. There is the potential for some good things happening, simplification of the foundation excise tax, which Vicki mentioned, hopefully making permanent the IRA rollover rules. Where we have exposure is what happens with respect to charitable deductions. The blueprint, which House Republicans released last June, essentially protected it. Trump's tax plan puts it significantly at risk, with the possibility of significant caps that would be rather alarming. So there are clearly multiple issues that could be debated and addressed, both good and bad, from the philanthropic sector, and as part of a massive tax reform overhaul, which we are likely to see coming at us literally as we speak. So that's just a little bit of the tax legislative agenda for 2017, and respectful of my time, Hadar, I'm going to turn it back to you now.
Thank you very much, Ken, for that analysis. So we've gotten some questions in, and we'll turn to those. I remind you again, you can type a question in on the question box in the upper right-hand corner. So I'm going to start with one actually for Vicki. We've got a question saying, how will American philanthropy as a whole be affected when looked at in conjunction with Brexit?
Thanks, Hadar, and thanks for that question. You know, I mean, I think clearly there's a theme and there's a pattern developing here around retrenchment within our borders, sort of a looking in, and I think this presents an enormous opportunity for philanthropy, because philanthropy is expansive. Philanthropy isn't bound directly to political cycles or shareholder returns. I think we have a really important role. We're about values, not politics. And I think it's our role to think more broadly, to build bridges. Particularly, this is very important in our international grant-making work as well. So this is an area that, for those of you who know Natalie Ross and our global team, this is something we're looking to explore more fully.
Thank you, Vicki. Connie, you're up. So we have a question saying, I agree with Connie regarding the need for accurate and effective information as to what to do to affect change and contribute to our own governance, to empower and not disempower, especially as we have a seeming void in leadership, this is a Martin Luther King sort, in our country. What are the reliable resources and sources that you would look to for proactive involvement? And Connie, I would just,
go ahead.
I just added on my own. I think it's a question of, maybe about literally some sources, but I would back it up a step and say, as people are looking to get engaged and to be proactive and be part of the solution, What do you think are the venues and the opportunities for that?
Well, I guess if I'm going to talk about how you can make a difference or where to be activists, I'm going to say what I've been saying on social media in response to it and to my students. Being married to a senator has given me quite a perspective over the last 13 years in terms of what they listen to and who they listen to on both sides. I hate the expression both sides, Republicans and Democrats, and your independents there. Constituents weighing in really does make a difference because they actually keep a running total. And so that is doubly clear. Lobbyists can be effective to a point, but when elected officials really start having to pay attention because they have no choice, it's when they feel like their constituents are weighing in ways that they hadn't expected. Right before this call, I talked to somebody in Sherrod's Cleveland office because I was just curious what was going on with the Steve Bannon appointment, for example. And she told me it's been nonstop calls, nonstop. And you understand the Senate doesn't even weigh in on this hire, right? But people are telling their stories and overwhelmingly in opposition to them. But Sherrod certainly has to keep track also of calls that come in that oppose something he's doing. And it often does lead to additional staff research. It can sometimes lead to a changed mind. I know some will say that sounds mighty idealistic, except that I have seen this unfold in the halls of Congress numerous times, not enough, but I don't want us to dismiss the value of that. And honest lobbying, of course, being forthright about what you're trying to do. And there's a very low threshold of patience right now for any clever. And I'm sure I'm not speaking to anybody who's on this call. So that's where I start with that. And of course, an informed electorate and an informed, I'm speaking to the choir, obviously, when I say it is important that we focus on facts. And what we've learned is that facts didn't really matter a lot to a lot of people. But we must watch our language about that. I've always said as a liberal, there are two types of liberal. There are the liberals who say they care about us, but they don't really want to mingle with my people. And then there are those of us who come from those people, and they know the difference. And that's something we've learned right now. So I think a whole lot more listening rather than talking is also advisable for every last one of us, including those of us who make our living expressing our opinion.
Yeah. Thank you, Connie. We're going to go micro to macro and back and forth here a little bit. So, Ken, we've got a question that I'm going to send your way, which is there any indication that Congress will act to repeal the Johnson Amendment? And for folks on the line, that would be about enabling 501c3 organizations, churches in particular, to engage politically from the pulpit to endorse candidates, et cetera.
Oh, there's definitely a possibility that it could happen, but Trump actually came out in favor of it. Frankly, in one respect, it probably should, since that kind of thing is done every election, and really the IRS doesn't ever do anything about it. But I'd say there's a very good chance that it could actually happen.
It's going to be an interesting next session, that's for sure. So our next question we're going to bandy about here, I think, among a few of us, is what can we tell our grantees about the very uncertain future that we're facing? And I actually think I'm going to take first crack at that, because one answer that we have from the perspective of the council and what we share with our members to share with grantees, is about our business and about the tax policy we've been discussing, which is clearly uncertain. And I think what we can tell them is that they need to be making sure to raise their voices and to weigh in on these issues directly. That we often have what I think is an artificial and certainly unhelpful divide between the philanthropy and the charities about who's raising their voices, who's speaking up when it comes to the tax policy issues that enable our sector to do the work that we're all here for. And I think it's a time, both an opportunity, but also there's an urgency to making sure that we bring all of those voices to the table and that everybody is coming together to talk about what are going to be increased needs in our country. So that's the first piece. I'm going to hand it to Vikki, and then Connie or Ken, if you want to weigh in on this after Vikki.
So I'm just going to build on what Hadar said, and that is that we are, just as an example, working very intentionally right now with independent sector in new and I think exciting and productive ways. This gathering of communications professionals that I mentioned in my remarks that's happening Thursday is being pulled together to help answer this very question. How can we, as a charitable sector, including philanthropy and charities, be more responsive to grantees? And I think this is a time for both the philanthropic voice and the charitable voice to align here. I think we're still, you know, I don't want to sound uncertain, but I think we are all still grappling with these very questions ourselves, and it's helpful to see sort of where the pulse points are for you all, so that we can focus in more on your specific concerns.
May I make an additional suggestion?
Yes.
I am a big believer in the power of story, and a lot of your media operations in the various cities where your grantees now are working are seeing diminished staff who actually need more help to tell stories. And if you've got, first of all, I would encourage you to have strong writers, strong storytellers in your organization who can present these stories, who can write them and send them to reporters and editors, because they're much more likely to get published now than they ever were. And by telling a story about somebody who's affected by either the good work of the grantee or who's going to suffer if the money is lost, that's a way to generate reader mail and reader concern, also donor concern. And just as importantly, again, it goes to calls to members of Congress then if it's running in their districts. So not only do I think it's important to have those, right, there are so many unemployed journalists in just about any city you could mention who I would recommend seeking out to work for you if you don't have a writer on staff, because reporters are hungry to tell these stories. They do not have the resources for the most part that they used to. Even the largest news organizations will be open to a well-written release that starts with a very strong story that illustrates the bigger problem. That's the key when you do this. I mean, I hope at some point you actually have a workshop on how to do this, because it could be very effective.
Thank you, Connie. That's great.
Thank you, Ken. Anything you want to add on that? Otherwise, we've got another question.
Nothing here.
Okay, well then get teed up for this one, because I'm going to read it, I'm going to start it, and then you're on deck. So the question that came in is, some analysts have estimated that impacts to charitable giving will come more from changes like tax rate changes and a standard deduction, rather than changes to the charitable deduction. And the question is, what proactive policy proposals are we or should we be exploring? And I'll start it off by saying, you know, as Ken said, we're all anticipating broad, comprehensive tax reform that really has everything on the table. And I think Vikki highlighted a little bit of the work we've been doing here for the past year and before, focusing on, of course, you know, the rollover to donor advised funds, the private foundation excise tax, other, I would say, targeted pieces like that. You know, I think to me right now, there are a number of other proactive pieces we're looking at, including the idea of, you know, a charitable savings account that would be a pre-tax account, or bringing some other new ideas to the table to a Congress and an administration that, you know, may well be open to some new ideas. But I think the real issue on the table is we are going to have to justify and defend all of the existing provisions that underpin our sector, and, you know, need to really be bringing a strong, comprehensive argument to the table. Ken, you want to dig into that or add to that?
Sure. Here's what I would add to it, and this is going to seem like a cop-out, but the answer to this question is actually very complicated, because it depends on the mix of changes that are included in tax reform. So just to kind of give you a simplified picture, if we didn't touch the deduction of the charitable contribution at all, but we reduced the highest individual marginal rate to 20% from its current level, which at the federal level is 43.4, which when you add to the average state tax is really closer to 50. If we made that change alone, the organization at the University of Indiana that's the Center for Philanthropy, I can't remember their name, but they do a lot of modeling on this topic. They would predict a significant effect on charitable giving. Not because all charitable giving is tax motivated, but it is relevant. If on the other hand, you don't touch marginal rates at all, but you cap the charitable deduction, which the various versions of the Trump plan do at some, what for many people that give generously would be a low dollar amount, like $100,000 or $200,000 a year, you could have a massive impact on charitable giving, even though you haven't touched the marginal rate. So the bottom line here is it depends on the mix of changes in terms of how they alter current law, both marginal rates and charitable deduction specific provisions, as to what the net impact on charitable giving is. And so that's why the details really do matter.
Great. Thank you, Ken. I'm going to go to one more that I'm going to direct to Vikki, and then we'll see if other folks want to weigh in. Is there a sense of urgency that we should communicate with donors and prospects about potential changes in the charitable tax deduction? And I'm going to enlarge that really in related policy, or is it premature to sound the alarm?
So I'm going to answer this two ways. I do believe there is a sense of urgency. I think it may be premature to sound the alarm, but not premature to get our act together and rally our troops. And one of the challenges we have had as a sector is we often feel like Chicken Little, always saying the sky is going to fall, the sky is going to fall, and we have a hard time sort of mobilizing folks like you do in all of the campaigns you fund in your advocacy work. We don't tend to turn those same tools and disciplines to ourselves, and I think this is a real moment, particularly around growing threats to endowed philanthropy, to put together all of the elements that we would need to be ready in the event of an attack. We've done some of this through the Charitable Giving Coalition, but I think this moment in time requires philanthropy itself to have its own voice with regard to these matters, and we're working hard to do that, and we're working through our public policy committee. We have a proposal that many of you on this call have probably seen about sort of beginning to build a war chest in support of this work. And Ken, I'd like to turn to you, because Ken has sent me a very compelling letter about sort of what's happened in the past when various other clients in other areas were not ready and not prepared. So this is I think a moment for us to really get ready. Ken?
Well, to that point, I would say two things. To quote Rahm Emanuel, that you should never let a crisis, the opportunity a crisis presents, to go unused. Let me state the obvious, which is there's going to be a pretty good argument that people can make between now and the end of the year that this will be a great time to give, because the tax benefits of charitable giving might decline under tax reform. So I would encourage everybody to take advantage of it. But to your specific point, Vikki, and I have listed for Vikki a number of examples of sectors or industries that were unprepared for legislative change, and the outcome was distinctly unpleasant. And just to name a few, the TIAA-CREF was a tax-exempt life insurance company that got caught off guard by the '96 Act when its tax exemption was taken away. Blue Cross Blue Shield, the Blue Cross Blue Shield organizations had been tax exempt since the income tax was enacted in 1913, and lost that tax exemption in the 1986 Act. There's a thing that was called the cross-border leasing industry. It was a multi-billion-dollar industry, and out of nowhere in 2004, the industry was wiped out. Essentially, it involved cross-border lease transactions involving very large assets like airplanes and power plants and things like that. But it was a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it literally, with the stroke of a pen, when the 2004 Act was signed, it disappeared. And part of my message to Vikki on this was this threat to endowments is one that we really need to take seriously, because, again, as I said in my earlier comments, there are people on the left and the right that, for different reasons, would like to tell us how to spend our money. And woe be us that the left and the right decides to come together on this before we have woken up and realized that we have a serious fight on our hands.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks. I think Jesse Salazar has something to add here too.
Yes, hi, I'm Jesse Salazar. I'm VP of Content Design at the Council, but I thought I'd give some insight because I also serve as chair of the Communications Network, which many of you know supports communicators in the social sector. And we've been having a lot of conversations in that community since the election about the role that foundations have taken in engaging with the public. Historically, many foundations did not have communications functions at all, and in recent years they have built that capacity with, in some cases 6, in some cases 12, in some cases 2 staff members on their communications team. And as we say at the Council often, foundations are about so much more than just dollars and cents. Foundations have a big community leadership role. They have a big role in sharing ideas and expertise. And in the information age in which we're all living, foundations are in many ways about ideas and working to support the ideas that can make a difference in communities. And in this new information age, those ideas are spread through communications. And so we've been talking quite a bit about how this election may spur many new foundations to consider new ways of expanding the ways that they are engaging with the public. And so I just ask that you stay tuned and please be in regular contact with your communications team to think about how your foundation's ideas might be spread in this new context and how you might be able to engage with the public in new ways.
Thanks, Jesse. So I think we're a few minutes past our time, and so I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank Connie. I want to thank Ken. I want to thank all of you who have stuck with us through the hour. If we did not take your questions, we have them. You will get responses to your questions. We'll be doing that via email, so be on the lookout. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your membership in the Council on Foundations, and stay tuned in Snapshot to get updates on our work. Thank you very much.